Yeah, and thank you for the acknowledgement, Adrian. This work has taken place on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. So I, of course, also pay my respects to the people of the Eastern Kulin Nation and their ancestors and past, present and emerging leaders in that community. So I am a PhD candidate at the with the Green Infrastructure Research Group at the University of Melbourne. And Adrian asked that I talk to my first experiment, which is the Gatehouse Street experiment. And I thought what I'd do is preface that with some of the broader goals of my PhD. And then we'll dig into some of the details of what happened in Gatehouse Street and what's there now. So broadly, my PhD program is looking at direct seeding and whether we can use this with substrate surface treatments to establish species-rich flowering native meadows. So I'll get to what substrate surface treatment actually means. But the kind of context in which I want to locate this work is hostile or contaminated urban sites. There's already been a great, amazing deal of research done in grassland restoration, and I'm not aiming to replicate that directly in urban sites. Rather, I want to deal with actual really nasty hostile sites. And again, I'll unpack what I mean by that shortly. But to create these plant communities, I would like to use Southeast Australia's magnificent grassland and grassy woodland flora. And of course, being amongst you people, I'm sort of preaching to the converted. I don't need to spell out why we need to do that, or indeed, you know, some of the aesthetic benefits that can result, because you all know how beautiful these species can be. I might just get rid of this. No, do that, yes. So some of the goals of this work are to reinstate species that have been long lost from our urban landscape, and reacquaint people with the natural and cultural heritage of this place. So things that were here prior to European settlement that we've built our cities on, because they corresponded with beautiful, flat, arable land in many cases. And to avoid this extinction of experience where people just are not seeing the plant species anymore and kind of forget how important they are. Of course, we can reinstate Indigenous food and fibre plants to our urban domain. And importantly, I think we can provide a future seed source. So there's some incredible work being done to grow native seeds, but probably, I think a lot of us would agree, not enough people in this space. And we can't always keep making a call on a remnant plant community to provide seed for future restorations when we've got less than 1% of our temperate grassland here in Victoria. And, you know, our grassy woodlands are really in a similarly dire state. So perhaps this work can provide a future seed source. But the list goes on. The other reasons I'm kind of keen to do this is we can create, hopefully, species-rich native ground layer or understory plant communities that provide resources for other trophic levels, particularly insects, but also birds that feed on those insects. And we know from a lot of the research that's listed here that, you know, it's the understory vegetation, both the volume and the diversity of that understory vegetation, that is driving species diversity in our landscape. But also there's kind of some more prosaic reasons. If we can prove that these vegetation communities are a success in an urban site, they only need to be mown or burned once a year. And so we can hopefully pitch some real lower maintenance costs to councils and public land managers when we compare it to, say, the intensive management required for mown turf. So, you know, mowing once or twice a month through summer, for instance. We hope by using species from Southeast Australia that we've got a sort of ready-made drought-adapted plant community. But we also hope that we can use the beauty that's inherent in our grasslands and grassy woodlands to create a plant community that's got real aesthetic appeal and long flowering interest. And I wanted to really highlight that point tonight because I think I wanted to draw the distinguish between meadows as an approach that's somewhat different to grassland restoration. So we know from a lot of international research and a little bit that's been done here that if we provide the punters with flowers and a long season of flowering interest, they're generally going to be more accepting of a landscape that is, shall we say, messy or wild. So we know that if we can push the sort of floral kind of component of a grassy flowering plant community, that we're going to get more public support and therefore more tolerance for this kind of planting in the urban domain. And so that's why I took an early decision to call these meadows rather than sort of grasslands, because we're accepting of the fact that they're not the real thing. We don't even get close to creating some of the amazing species diversity that we find in the natural landscape. So just to labour a little bit further on this point about creating diverse understory vegetation for other trophic levels, I think there's been some really interesting research done here in Melbourne. So Cara Threlfall looked at vegetation in golf courses, in parks and in urban kind of environments, and found that the cover of understory vegetation, so long grass, herbs and small shrubs, was really driving an increase in bird species richness and bat species richness. And in a really interesting study, Lewis Marta looked at Linda Tegg's magnificent Grasslands work on the steps of Parliament that's pictured there. And he compared what was going on in terms of insect diversity in the mown patches to either side. That's just a traditional turf grass community. What was happening in this pop-up vegetation that John Del Pratt, who's here, had a real role in helping Linda create, and what was happening in the more ornamental garden beds. And what Lewis was finding was that even in the pop-up vegetation, so this vegetation that's literally been plonked down there overnight, there was a much greater diversity and abundance of insect species. So I always feel like I'm doing our great nursery goers a bit of a disservice with this slide, but I think it is important to sort of ask the question, why can't we just use tube stock? And we have Indigenous nurseries doing an amazing job turning out really fabulous array of species that belong to grasslands and grassy woodlands. And I would say these are entirely appropriate to use, and actually wonderful to use where we can have appropriate maintenance. But I think maybe some of us can agree that what we often see in sort of a broad scale public kind of landscape planting sense is these get put in at, you know, sort of X number of plants per metre squared spacing. And often what we get is a weed invasion cycle. The weeds get in the gaps between the plants and get sprayed out, and often take out our Indigenous species with it. So with the direct sowing, we're aiming for a couple of things: dense cover, so eliminating some of those gaps and preventing future weed invasion. And we're also hoping that direct sowing can represent additional species richness at a lower cost. So we're not having to pay for some of those hours in the nursery producing tube stock, but we're able to therefore cover a larger area at these species. So my work draws on two research traditions, and one of them is actually from the UK. There's sort of some similar work that's done in the US, but that's the meadow movement. And there's some fabulous practitioners such as James Hitchmore, who did some time here at Burnley, but also Nigel Dunnett. And what they've created is a landscape practice where they sow floristically diverse meadow communities. And they're ecologically informed. So they're scouring the world's plant communities for species that can readily establish from seed and persist. So reseed themselves and also provide really long flowering interest, because they're hooking into this fact that the punters really like the flowers. They do a lot of work to select compatible plant heights and shapes. But importantly to me, they use a low nutrient substrate in many cases for their sowings, and this is to avoid weed invasion. And they irrigate to push rapid germination, not in all instances, but in a lot. And so it was sort of those two kind of cues that I took out of their practice that I thought, well, we could do here. And I am asking the question, I suppose, we could just import this work and sow these international plant pellets into urban domains throughout Melbourne, and perhaps there is a place for that. But I would argue quite strongly that there's species within our own Indigenous plant communities that can serve the purposes that these meadows are providing in terms of floral interest and endurance. So the other research tradition that's been really important to inform my research is grassy ecosystem or grassland restoration. Some of the magnificent work that's been done by the likes of Suzanne Prober or Paul Gibson Royal or John Del Pratt. You know, it's an incredible tradition that I think all of you are quite well appraised of. But, you know, what we can learn from that is that once we've lost these species from the landscape, and we need to provide seed to get them back, that there's not an enduring seed bank. So we need to provide those propagules back if we want the species to re-emerge. And the other big thing that we're up against is, of course, soil nutrient enrichment. So where we've had a lot of superphosphate thrown out in the interest of farming, or even through atmospheric deposition of nitrogen, what we've done in many cases is fundamentally change the nutrient profile of the landscape. And those nutrients there in the upper soil profile and are freely available to weed species who are frequently able to outcompete the native species, particularly in a newly sown environment. And so we need to deal with this soil nutrient enrichment if we're to get a good result from the seed that we put out. So soil scalping, I think, is an approach that a lot of you are familiar with. And this is coming along and removing the top layer of the soil and taking with it the weed seeds and the nutrient-enriched topsoil. And this has enabled really good species-rich restorations through Western Victoria with really good cover and persistence once they're in place. So this is some of John's work, which I'm sure he's shared with you, a restoration that involved scalping to 100 odd millimetres, but that topsoil is being removed from site and the sowing is happening into that nutrient impoverished soil below. And what is happening beyond that is a beautiful emergence of quite a species rich plant community, Indigenous plant community with really good cover. So I'm a terrific fan of the Warndoo Chatsworth Lanka group's work and everything that they're doing out there west. And it's been a huge asset to kind of be appraised of that work and to learn how to adapt it into an urban site. So I would argue that soil scalping is entirely appropriate for an urban site in some cases, but not all. And so why am I pursuing new techniques for urban contexts? It's this idea of hostile urban soils. So there's many reasons we might encounter these. We might have contamination in the form of asbestos, or other contaminants like PFAS. We might have underground services immediately below the soil profile that we can't dig up, we can't put our bulldozer through, or perhaps it's a new building site and we haven't got a soil resource, so we have an opportunity to bring in a specially engineered low nutrient soil resource there. And so my work is all about finding these alternative techniques to put these plant communities in place. So drawing on the UK tradition, the first question we ask is, well, can we use sand? Because that's what they're using there, and they're using it for very similar reasons. They want to bury the weed seeds. They want to provide a nutrient poor substrate that can similarly support seed germination, and then they're going to sow into that. So sand is a potential option. And of course, doing this removes our need to disturb site soils. Now, there are other low nutrient substrates that we might like to use, and some of those might be more similar in their physical and chemical characteristics to the soils on which grasslands actually grow. So sand is a coarse sort of free draining matrix, but a lot of our species are growing, you know, with their very wet feet on basalt, heavy basalt soils out in the west. So is it possible that we can use finer texture substrates instead of sand is another question that my PhD research will answer, I hope. And I'm also interested in this capacity in an urban domain to design a substrate to provide a tailored solution. So starting, I guess, from moving from the broad PhD context to what we actually did at Royal Park. This first experiment was really kind of an initial foray to answer a couple of questions. Well, just one, can we actually do this? Using sand, can we actually get a reasonably good species-rich native wildflower meadow on an urban site? And importantly, perhaps sort of, you know, it seems a little dim as a question to ask, but what are the labour inputs that we're requiring to manage these landscapes through to establishment? And I say dim, it's probably a silly way to say it, but it doesn't sound very scientific to ask how much labour time we're putting into managing these landscapes through to establishment, but these are really very real concerns if you're a council or public land manager looking to do similar work. So we want to provide some sort of quantification of costs and effort up front to establish these landscapes. And we want to play around with depth. So if we're accepting that we're using sand and we want to see if that works, how much sand do we need to put down to effectively bury those weed seeds? And what is the composition of the plant community that we get once we direct sow into that sand? So the context for this work is Royal Park, and I'm indebted to Nick Williams, my supervisor, for this particular image that he found, I think, at the State Library. But Royal Park is, of course, the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and a very important meeting site, but was later reserved by Governor Latrobe in 1845 as part of a sort of ring of parks around Melbourne. He envisaged a city encircled by parks. And at this point in time, this is from 1855, this is part of that circle, and it's a bit of land that included the University of Melbourne, Melbourne General Cemetery, Princes Park, and it was gazetted as a public park in 1876. But if you look at this image and you see all those dots there, what we're learning is that it's grassy woodland at this stage. So not so much grassland, but it would have been grassy woodland, which accords with the EVC mapping that we can use today. So that's the park now to the right, right on the doorstep of Melbourne CBD. But throughout its history, it's a little bit unique in Melbourne's park system in that it's always been envisaged as a natural parkland with wide open spaces and a predominantly native planting. So if you compare it to, say, Treasury Gardens or some of the parks that have become far more ornamental in the way the landscape is managed and delivered, Royal Park has managed to maintain that sort of a more naturalistic look and feel. But for all that, it's had a lot of uses. It's been used for military encampments. It has a long association with sport, including cricket and football and netball. It has one of Melbourne's earliest public golf courses. And it still has a little bit of remnant grassy woodland down near Brens Drive as well. So there's a lot going on in Royal Park. Another thing that happened in its history, which importantly for our thinking would have changed some of the soil profiles at the site, was that they gave the Acclimatisation Society a bunch of land to road test exotic species, plant and animal. So they would have been throwing out fertiliser and ploughing and doing all sorts of things to modify the existing soil profile. And that, of course, later became the zoo. At another stage, it was used for dumping Melbourne's night soil, so plenty of nutrient enrichment in the form of Melbourne's waste too. But we do have a long history of planting native trees, even before 1934. But a key prior land use that I wanted to mention is a military encampment. This is the Second World War Camp Pell, and this is after the war, where the huts that were built for American soldiers here on the Grassland Circle, or what is now the Grassland Circle, were kept to house displaced persons, but then later were bulldozed into the soil. Excuse me. And the problem for us is that they contained asbestos. So we do have soil contamination at this site, which is a limitation on how the landscape can be managed to this day. Royal Park has a master plan. It's a 1984 master plan, and it came out of a design competition. And happily, the Laceworks Landscape Collaborative, who won the design competition, what they pitched was a retention of the natural values of Royal Park, cleared sort of grasslands on the tops of the hills with native tree plantings and sort of grassy woodland look and feel around the edges. And as part of their the master plan, they also proposed three major projects. and one of which was to create the native grassland circle. So on a hilltop right up the top of the park, you know, the crown jewel there, they wanted to reinstate grassland species and really celebrate that space in that way. And I've lost the slide that deals with all the attempts to do that. But essentially, what's happened since that master plan is a number of very intelligent and valiant attempts to create land, native grassland, including planting plugs, direct seeding, hydro seeding, spreading with limiter hay. But in all cases, what's kind of tended to happen is the weed invasion cycle, and there are a few patches of good thermiter patches on the grassland circle on the side of an old car park, but to the greater extent, it's a real mix of Indigenous grasses and pasture grasses, but probably the latter would dominate. I wanted to mention the City of Melbourne policy landscape. I used to think that policy wasn't worth the paper it was written on for a brief moment of my life. But I think what's really instructive here is how a sequence of policies has driven a real ambition to reinstate native plant species into the landscape. So the urban forest strategy was the first to propose a biodiversity strategy, which later arrived in the form of the Nature in the City strategy. And importantly for us is that included a target, a very clear target to reinstate Indigenous understory habitat on City of Melbourne managed land and increase that volume by 20%. And so it's those kind of real targets that have provided an anchor for City of Melbourne to drive some quite sizable biodiversity gains in their municipality. And that's, of course, why they've been very supportive of this work. So moving to the experiment, it was set up in autumn of 2020. You might remember there was a thing called a pandemic, but we somehow wriggled clear of that to put this experiment in place just in time. And it's a site of about, 1,300 square metres. And it was previously mulch underneath eucalypts, predominantly Eucalyptus camaldulensis. And that's been managed for a long time with herbicide management to remove any kind of species that might spontaneously emerge into that mulch. On one side, you have a road and a bicycle path. On the other side, you have Royal Park itself. So it sits on the edge, and there's actually a circle of this kind of landscape treatment right around Royal Park available to become meadows. But for the first try here, we just occupied a small part up near the native garden, and we sowed 27 Indigenous wildflower and grass species into this space. And we went through a species selection process that was about dealing with very real monetary and space constraints in terms of the volume of native seed that we could grow. We purchased some truly magnificent grass seed from Native Seeds, thanks Darren. But for the wildflower component, we had to grow our own seed in a seed production area, and we were limited by space and resources. So we had to choose the species that we could grow. So looking at our grasslands, looking at our grassy woodlands, thinking, well, what are the species that we know to be reliable from seed? And that's, I have a great debt to John Del Pratt for having a lot of experience in that space and being able to provide a lot of advice. But also, what are the species that we can combine to provide that long season of flowering interest? So we probably had a little room for experimentation, but for the most part, with that sort of limited palette, we needed to kind of pick the winners and the reliable species. And the experimental design consisted of 6 surface treatments. So we had 2 depths of sand and the site soils, and the 2 depths of sand were 10 millimetres and 80 millimetres of sand. They were either covered with a jute covering or not covered with a jute covering. So that gives us the 6 surface treatments. I weeded each of these every second month, and that was a kind of interesting experience in the context of a pandemic, but really wanted to kind of exert a level of control over who was doing the weeding and how, so we could quantify some of the labour hours going in there. And we monitored plant cover, species richness, on 2 occasions throughout the experiment. So the data collection was complete for this after a year of it being in the landscape. And I've been playing with that data. I can't tell you a paper yet because I haven't quite finished it, but I'm working on a paper to publish out of this experiment. So this is kind of what we were dealing with 1 month after sowing. Across the top. You can still see the different patterning of that, the sand on the previously mulched area. And I think the neighbours at this point were thinking, what on earth are these people doing? They're throwing out sand pits into the landscape. But at 7 months, we're starting to see that plant community emerge to differing degrees on the different substrates. So this kind of illustrates that. So across the top, you've got 2 panels representing our 80mm depth of sand. And the top left, we have what was going on at 3 months. Compared to immediately below it, what was going on at 3 months on a soil plot. So I think, I hope what you can see there is we've got bigger plants, and we've probably got, just that they're taking advantage of those resources in the soil matrix to really go for it, whereas the 80mm sand is a little bit slower to emerge. If we jump over to the 2 right hands, we've got the sand again at the top and the soil at the bottom. The soil by this stage is well and truly a dense plant community at 6 months. And the sand is still a little bit patchy, but we've got flowering and we've got slightly better cover. And what we found was that while the sand plots were slower to sort of germinate and establish, these differences disappeared really by December 2020, so about 8 months afterward. And now I promised Adrian sciencey looking stuff, so this is what you get. It's horrific, but I will explain it. So at 6 months in the red box, we are seeing some differences in cover. So this is the cover of sown plant species on the y-axis. And we are seeing in 80mm on the right-hand side, what I just told you, that there was slightly less cover. And in fact, that difference when we compare it to the soil plots, either with or without jute, was significant at 6 months. But then if we fast forward in time and we go to 12 months, we're finding that we've got no differences statistically between the treatments. And really, what this graph is telling us is there's a relatively uniform plant community in terms of cover across these different treatments. And then if we think about plant density, so how many of our sown plants per metre squared, and we're thinking about grasslands with their, quite amazing species richness and quite dense plant communities, we're finding, interestingly, the converse. We've got the highest densities on 80mm sand plots without jute. And this is a very interesting result, and we need to do a little bit more unpacking to explain why we were getting this. But we are finding that, we're getting higher plant counts on 80mm without jute than soil plots, but also on the equivalent 80mm sand plots with jute. And we think snails may play a role, and hope to answer that soon. But if we rescale that graph, that's the same graph, just rescaled, and we add in our 12 months. A lot of you being familiar with grasslands, this is our 2nd generation recruitment now. So we've got much higher plant densities because we're incorporating into this graph all that 2nd generation recruitment of particularly C3 grasses. And but the other thing we're finding is that in terms of plant densities across the treatments, again, at 12 months, those differences have fallen away, and we've got a fairly uniform plant community. So, and that's kind of what it looks like in practice, is you can't see the patchwork of sand plots and non-sand plots anymore. And this is 8 months after sowing, but we've got a fairly uniform plant community here. And so for all that, you might say, well, why would we bother putting 80mm of sand down if we're getting the same result after 8 or even 12 months? And it's a good question, and it's particularly relevant when you're the one paying for that sand. But the answer lies in some of the maintenance inputs. So this is a very coarse graph, but I think it does a good job of stripping out all the questions of jute or no jute and just answering, well, which one took the most work to get through to quite a dense level of cover with limited opportunities for weed invasion. And the purple at the top is our soil plots with no sand at all. And the yellow down the bottom is our 80mm sand plots. And intermediate line is, of course, our 10mm sand plots in green. And so this is a cumulative curve of investment of time weeding, and these plots are 24 meters squared. And so, you know, we're finding that we've got a significant difference in terms of labour investment to get this plant community established. What that looks like in a slightly more horrible graph is if we add in now these questions of jute or no jute, are we driving differences there? So our jute plots here on the y-axis, we have the time to weed the plots, mean across the year. And on our jute plots, of course, we've got highest in soil, least in 80mm of sand, but the same pattern in no jute. So we're seeing the final horrible graph slide. And again, here, what I want to draw your attention to is this difference between soil and 80mm of sand in terms of time spent weeding. And there's an equivalent here in terms of weed biomass that we took off the plots and looked at. And that's both the case in the plots with the jute and the plots without the jute. But the other thing, there's some bolded numbers in this, it's horrendous table. And what this is designed to illustrate is that those significant differences were really sort of front-ended toward the first 6 to 8 months of the meadow establishment. So what this is telling us from a maintenance perspective, if you're planning a sowing similar to this, is that you want to be building in time up front, where you're irrigating, you're providing plenty of resources to support your sown plant community, but also any wind-blown seed. And so you need to weed in the initial stages to get the more resilient closed plant community later on. Perhaps more satisfyingly, resources for wildlife, you know, there's some really nice results from this experiment that we can have and hold in terms of visual and aesthetic appreciation. And it certainly was a case that build it and they will come. We went from a mulch site with very little resources to a lot of floral resources for our birds and butterflies and bees. And there's actually sort of some interesting work that Adrian might like to sort of look at later on when it's finished at the kind of insect communities they're using Indigenous plant communities in Melbourne versus in exotic plant communities. So very interesting stuff coming out of our research group on this as well. Of the 27 species that we sowed, we got 25 on this site within that first year, to varying degrees. And so there's 2 species that, to my knowledge, have still not appeared on this first sowing. Euringium, I think we had pretty rubbish seed, and I think the same could be said for our Leptorhynchus, which was quite predated seed. When I say 2 varying degrees, and I think that's important, we had a couple of very dominant plants in this plant community, and sort of a core set of particularly C3 grasses and a few forbs. And then we had the ones that have showed up perhaps more sporadically and to a lesser degree. Sorry, I really should have had water to hand. And included in those is we had Cullen tenax, our ruidodosis, and I've drawn a mental blank. Our Leucochrysum albicans. So a couple of threatened species turning up as well. I wanted to mention seed production because it was a critical component of this work. I benefited greatly from John's expert advice in this sense, but we set up a seed production area in spring of 2019 to supply seed for this project. And we've kept it going through various iterations to supply seed for subsequent projects. We play a little bit at the margins with a few riskier species, but we like to keep a core set of the more reliable species in production. And I think what I would say here is that, while this kind of containerized system can be set up and maintained reasonably easily, and we've done so with a lot of recycled kind of inputs and keeping costs low, what we would like to see is the emergence of an industry growing forb seed. And I know there are a few people playing this space at the moment, but once we get more forb seed being produced, then we're going to be able to achieve this kind of work in urban settings at a greater scale. And there is a tremendous amount of interest in this work, which is pleasing, from councils, lots of different kind of domains, but the urban environment is a good place in which you can recruit support and therefore resources in terms of installation and maintenance for the restoration of Indigenous plant communities. A shout out also to the magnificent seed science team at Royal Botanic Gardens Melbourne, particularly Meg Hurst and co. What we were able to do with their help was to get some very robust germination data for this experiment, which informed our seed mixes. So we weren't kind of steering blind and just sowing whatever we had, but we were able to kind of have a reasonable expectation, well, as far as germination tests can provide, of what kind of plant counts we might get from a specific volume of seed for each species. And so we were able to mix seed accordingly. It should be noted, in my mother's kitchen, where we made a delightful mess. So moving on from Gatehouse Street, and I hope I've done a decent job in just kind of capturing what that experiment was designed to achieve and what we've found so far. The rest of my PhD will be looking at this question of whether or not we can use recycled substrates as well as these mined sands, and therefore bring into this kind of practice some closed loop principles. So, if cities are responsible for destroying our grasslands, but we're also interested in reinstating grassland species into our cities, can we use waste products, urban waste products, to facilitate that goal? So subsoils are soils below generally 0.5 metre, and they're a readily available waste product in Melbourne. And they're known for having poor structure as well as low nutrients. So the low nutrients aspect ticks our goal of a substrate that's not going to support prolific weed growth, but will support our sown plant community. But what I mean by poor structure is if we get out the hose and squirt this clod from Preston, or we, subject it to some rainfall, it's probably going to turn into a fairly milky soup and run down the nearest drain. And that might not be so suitable for an urban environment with the typical wear and tear and high usage factors that we see there. So we know from some of Paul Gibson-Roy's work that we can use unmodified subsoils to support the emergence of grassland species. But we're thinking, well, how do we perhaps amend the structural aspects of these soils to make them more resilient to the pressures of an urban environment? And so I just threw this in there to kind of illustrate the very dark fact that, it's precisely this kind of development that's sort of seeing us lose a lot of grasslands, but it's, this is where we're actually digging up high volumes of basalt subsoil, which are currently being tipped, and developers are paying to tip that waste. So my second experiment at Burnley has been running for over a year now, and this was taking the sand that we knew worked from Gatehouse Street, but also comparing it to a couple of different subsoils from different parent geologies, and we're mixing those subsoils in a couple of cases with stones and various products that can make it potentially more robust to drive the tractor over or walk on in a curbside environment. So this will provide a really interesting test of some of the same metrics: species richness, cover, plant community composition, but looking at whether once we vary the substrate characteristics, we get a different result, also in terms of labour to establish. And I wanted to kind of probably labour this point a little bit, but I've taken this deliberate decision to call them meadows because I want to really acknowledge that this is not grassland restoration, but rather builds on the principles of grassland restoration. This is very much an approach that is tailored for a highly modified urban environment, and it's not the real thing, and it by no means justifies the loss of real grasslands to be doing this work. So I don't want it to be a get out of jail free card for public administrators, but I do want to provide a means to reinstate threatened plant communities in our urban environment. And of course, I'm going to labour that point that native seed production is needed once again. And this is the decade of ecosystem restoration. We do have, by virtue of some very ambitious targets in terms of the hectare-based targets of how much land we want to restore. And if we're going to be doing that at scale in Australia, we're going to need a really reliable and fabulous seed industry. I think I've got 5 minutes left just to briefly mention where we go from here, beyond me. And this is Gatehouse Meadow 2.0, I'm calling it. And this is a second meadow that's just down the hill on Gatehouse Street from the 2020 meadow that I've talked to you this evening about. And this is the work of a master's student, Sophia Blossfelds, who's with the Green Infrastructure Research Group with me. And she's standing here with the team from Nature Links. So the really nice thing about this meadow is it starts to normalise delivery in a normal kind of council paradigm where you're hiring a landscape contractor, in this case, a very skilled one, obviously, to deliver and manage through to hand over a sown plant community. So Sophia's in there answering some really important questions about how much seed we can collect off these meadows for future sowing elsewhere in the municipality. And actually, there's already a call on some of her seed. But what she's done is play with seed mixes. She will look at results in terms of the plant community that's established on site, but also how much seed can she pull off and what is the quality of that seed in terms of germinability. So she's got some quite big plots, and she's sown those to 3 treatments: just forbs, just grasses, and a diverse mix of grasses and forbs. And there's another logic that sits behind this, which is Jim Morton, who's kind of the project sponsor at City of Melbourne, is also really interested. Well, if we just sow forbs only, can we maybe not hand weed, but use herbicide? That's not actually being tested here, but it is a future research question. And in the first instance, what we're seeing is the forb only sowings are actually achieving reasonably good cover. And that's her meadow at about 8 months after sowing. This is all sown on 1 depth of sand. So we split the difference and took 50 millimetres of sand from the first meadow. And that's actually been it's supported very rapid establishment of quite a diverse sown plant community. I think Sophia, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, sowed something in the order of 40 species. So she's jumped up in terms of species complexity here. And I think she's only to date missing about 3 or 4 of those. But perhaps Sophia can come back and talk to you about her results later on. That's Sophia with a fairly cool adaptation on your average leaf blower. And she's vacuuming up the seed into a bag that she's sown inside the devices bag. And she's collecting that seed to sow in a glasshouse trial and see what she gets from the loose seed and the seed that's already fallen off on the ground. So that germination trial is underway, and we hope to get some really good results from that. And Sophia is kneeling there at what will be the 3rd meadow. We hope to sow later this year, which is again another step up in terms of complexity. So we're getting out of the nice, safe, mulched area where we know we can get a good result, and we're going to what is a previously turf grassed verge between CSL's fence and a bike path. And here we're going to sow a diverse species mix. And again, we hope to apply some interesting research questions to that place. So I will finish by saying many thanks to you. I do need to fulfill my duty and show this horrible slide with references, but also to acknowledge the fact that my research is supported by City of Melbourne, and I'm very grateful for that support. also the Australian Government Research Training Program, and the estates of the late Frank Keenan, Betty Elliott, and Morris and Helen Wood and their families. So I'll go back there, and then I will see if I can find my way out of screen sharing and see if any of you are still there. Oh, there's more than one person. Yay.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Katherine. That's incredibly informative. And I thought I knew a bit about that project, but I only knew a small fraction of all of the stuff that you were doing. And it sounds like we're moving forward in a very good way. Anyone want to kick off with some questions, thorny or otherwise, for Katherine? I'm sure she'll. Yes, Alan.
Katherine, thank you very much for that. That's really quite amazing what you've managed to do. Has anyone thought, all right, of trying to encourage people with who still have gardens in the city and on their block to undertake a whole, a partial replanting of the block with local native species? Has anyone done any of that? I mean, no one's done it where I am, but.
Yeah, I think there's tremendous interest in that, Ellen, and I get a lot of questions from people. I think in the urban landscape, an area of sort of a hot area of interest at the moment is your verges. So, your mown verges that people are often loath to maintain because it's not their land. And there's a PhD student in my research group at the moment who's looking at native plantings on verges and the kind of insect communities that will use them. So she'll be monitoring pre and post establishment. I think there's real application if we can develop a fairly there's always going to be site considerations of thinking, well, what soils do you have? And it would always be useful to provide advice. But if we can really standardize a low nutrient substrate plus a very basic seed mix, I think we can open up this kind of approach to become accessible to a lot of people. Because the beauty of an urban environment, the things that I get away with that John can't get away with out west is that I have irrigation. I can irrigate to push a rapid result. I can therefore front end a lot of that maintenance into the early stages of plant community development. And so, yeah, there's a lot of really fascinating work and experimenting going on in this space. But we hope to, get some recipes together eventually that can make it really kind of foolproof. And in the UK, you can go and buy your meadow mix and your low nutrient substrate in a bag. And that's where we need to get to here. We need to make it as easy as possible to bring these species back.
It certainly is. Jack Dewhurst, I can see you have your hand up.
Hey, Katherine. Thank you for that. That was great. And I was just going to add on to that. Like, I imagine there's lots of interest in this from councils and from Melbourne City Council. Did you guys use Indigenous seed and kind of wondering about how you kind of sourced that for this project? I know you mentioned you got some from native seed, which to my understanding is not necessarily just collected from Melbourne, like kind of further away. And do you kind of see with more demand for this, like companies that are starting to kind of make that available?
Look, my hope is that, within Melbourne, we can have a reliable supply, particularly of the forb seed that's lacking. So we've had to grow our own forb seed. And I know that there are people sort of stepping into this space, but what we really need is kind of a good kick up the bum from government in terms of some, and John, I'm sure, has mentioned this before, but, policy incentives. Paul Gibson-Roy tells the magnificent story of how a car trip led to the generation of a seed industry in America because it was determined that roadside should be, a minimum area of roadside should be restored to native prairie. And that kick-started a seed industry because there was a reliable market for it. I think it will happen here in Victoria, but it would be nice if it happened a whole lot quicker, because if we can we're kind of trying to wriggle in the back door here and say, well, if we can create a domestic demand for our beautiful Indigenous flora, then we're also going to be bolstering a seed supply that can then furnish restoration at a grander scale, for instance, in the Western Grasslands Reserve and beyond. Does that answer your question, Jack?
Yeah, it's good. Hopefully it does.
Yeah.
John Dilpret, you had your hand up. If you unmute yourself, it'll be even more enjoyable.
Well, not necessarily, but here we go. Katherine, there's a question on the from Ben on the chat asking about the order of the laying of things. So sand, seed, jute. Just
Yeah. Yeah, correct. So jute was laid down after sowing. And I think, we're getting some really interesting results with jute. So I'm not prepared to call that one either way and say whether or not, but it ultimately by that 12-month mark, it's not making a huge difference. But where it does actually serve our interest is it stops cats getting in and digging and foxes making dead animal offerings to you in the middle of your meadow, which is not very pleasant. But the other thing is on a steeper site, say a road edge, that's going to provide a stabilizing environment that will keep your sand in place. So we did get some heavy rainfall after the sowing of the first meadow, which washed a little bit of sand out, but our jute plots were able to hold that sand on. So it does serve a purpose from a very functional point of view, but we're probably interested in unpacking a little bit further what it's doing from a plant community composition point of view. But importantly, yeah, we're sowing into the sand or the soil substrate and then putting the jute over the top.
Katherine, Ben's just come back. So yeah, point of clarification, the jute matting, it is in fact very open, so you might just explain that, because Ben was concerned that it was going to suppress seed germination. Yeah,
I don't have a photo of it I can show you, Ben, but Arbor Green Cell, one of the products, but it's basically got apertures that they're about an inch square, and the jute will actually break down fairly readily. So by 12 months, certainly in an irrigated environment, it's almost all gone. So it may actually impact a little bit of germination at the start of the plant community evolution, but in the long run, I don't think it's making a huge difference. But yeah, certainly good on a steep site. You could probably take it or leave it on a flat site.
It's a web rather than a mat, isn't it?
It's a web rather than a mat. Yeah, it's not like a Hessian sack. It's got apertures in it. Annette is asking if there's orchids in the mix, and I wish I could. I wish I could say I sowed some, and I think this is kind of. I've sat down recently and mapped out the evolution of this work in terms of all the other research questions that we need to ask of it, and one of them is certainly how to get the hard to get species. So we would love to flood the place with chocolate lilies, but they tend to be a bit reticent from seed. So how do we push seed treatments to furnish us with a better result? Orchids, of course, yes. We would love to broaden the species composition to be more representative of grasslands. Interestingly, we got one greenwood on my meadow, and I have no idea where it came from. So that was exciting. Stephen?
Yeah, thanks, Katherine. I missed the opportunity to come down and do have a field experience with you about 2 weeks ago with the Bellarine Land Care Group. So nice to hear about your projects firsthand tonight. I'm particularly, and this is the last question segues quite nicely into my question, and I don't really expect you to have an answer to this, but I'm just really pushing it out there as an issue that maybe needs to be looked at more in depth, and that is the relationship of mycorrhizae to the grassland plants in their long-term health. And I did notice that that sample that you had of subsoil sitting on the post had what looked like some mycelium, some fungi networks attached to it, which may be a really good, nice advantage to using that as a subsoil, because it's just some work. I've been involved in the revegetation industry for more than 40 years now. But one thing that we've always overlooked, and it's bothered me, and it's bothering me more as I get older, and that is we haven't looked at fungal relationships between plants. I just think that it's going to come back to haunt us if we don't.
Yeah, I have to absolutely agree with it. And I think that, you know, if I had time for a second PhD, that's exactly what it would be on. It would be fascinating to look at further. But yeah, look, these are some of the things that perhaps using those subsoils, just even beyond better matching the particle size and the composition of the media to what these plants are used to, at least we might be able to solve some other problems as well.
Right, thank you.
Any other questions? Katherine, I'll ask you a quick one. Well, you mentioned the atmospheric deposition of nitrogen from pollution and so on. I know I've read about that in the past, but I don't actually know anything about it. Is that actually much of a thing? Like, did we get higher nitrogen levels next to busy roads and more weed growth and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so that's certainly been really well documented in Europe. Now, my secondary supervisor the other day was talking to me about some work that has been done in Australia, but I've not read that work myself, Adrian. So I probably need to be better acquainted with the local context. But certainly, you know, we know that on a global scale, atmospheric deposition from industrial point sources and from roads and things like that is leading to a steady increase in the nitrogen content of grassy systems. So there's a really, I'm not going to be able to remember the name of the paper or even its author, but perhaps I can provide it to you, which was a bit of a meta look at that and where it's happening. Yeah,
that would be great indeed, because I know we have so many grasslands or so many freeways planned for immediately adjacent to grasslands. It's quite they seem to think that the two go quite well together, and they, I suspect, don't very well. Anyone else? Questions?
I'm back again. I've just put my hand up. Sorry.
I was wondering if that was a question. Yes,
I took it down, but no. Well, I thought your question was a good one, because a lot of the work that's been done about site preparation involves nutrient stripping, and I just wondered whether Katherine had really looked, or whether you considered doing that, or if you didn't, consider it why you decided not to do it.
Yeah, so this is where I've been quite narrow in my focus in my research, Stephen, is that I'm dealing with this real world problem of, and I like to call it the grassland circle conundrum. How do we, you know, given we've got a council with the resources and the ambition to reinstate a large area of grassland right close to the city, but we've got these constraints in terms of asbestos in the soil profile, how do we get around that? How do we develop approaches that are different to the scalping? So I don't actually need to be convinced of the success of scalping. I think, you know, I've seen John's work and it's, you know, it's a huge benefit, but there are sites where we're not going to be able to use it. And I think the other, and maybe John can talk to this, but the other interesting aspect is this idea of building up a low nutrient substrate layer might have other applications in terms of patch restoration in grasslands as well, where perhaps we've got rocky or stony rises where we don't want to disturb, but patches of, you know, exotic pasture grasses that we need to deal with. So I think it's about having a few different tools at our disposal, and scalping is one, and then I'm hoping that these approaches is another.
The application of carbon?
Yes, that's actually ironically where I started. I had again, I don't really need to be convinced of work, because it's, I think Suzanne Prober in particular has done an admirable job in testing that in a number of different contexts. But, you know, the addition of carbon on an ongoing basis at scale is going to be probably a prohibitive expense for a council that's looking to kind of keep rates down. So we're hoping we can kind of, put in perhaps a more enduring solution in terms of managing those nutrients.
Can I just jump in, Adrian?
Please, John.
Steve, yours was about nutrient stripping, and there may have been a slight misunderstanding there, but by that presumably you mean growing crops to strip nitrogen, but to strip nutrients out before you undertake the restoration. Is that,
Yeah,
what you meant by stripping?
well, there's a variety of methods that I've written about, but the most direct one, which I thought might have an application for Katherine, would be using an application of carbon like sugar, adding sugar, and then incorporating plant species like kangaroo grass that actually have been shown to lower the levels of nitrogen in the soil over about 18 months. So whether that sort of strategic approach, we're wanting to set up some trials on the Bellarine this year to actually test that, whether we can just do it on farms, set up some islands of really invasive indigenous plants, local plants to the area, add nutrient stripping strategies in the process, and enable them to spread beyond these islands that we're going to be planting here.
Katherine can vouch that there can never be too, in my opinion, there can never be too much kangaroo grass. But if you're going to use kangaroo grass as a stripper and as a start, and I've been talking about this for a very long time, you're then going to have one hell of a problem getting anything else to grow. But that's where, say, Katherine and Sophia's work might come in handy, that if you then patch in areas of wildflower, other grasses, whatever, actually, go in and patch them in using the sorts of techniques we're talking about tonight, either scalping or topsoil. I mean, a cap. We're not allowed to say capping. What am I allowed to say, Katherine?
You can say what you like here. They're not here.
Anyway, an addition of a subsoil, and if you patch into the thermiter, then maybe in generations you'll get a good a good mixing eventually. The Europeans have done a lot of stripping experiments, and they're finding it's taking a decade or more to even start to have an impact on the phosphorus levels. Nitrogen's easy, but phosphorus is very difficult, and of course often we're dealing with a phosphorus problem on these sites. The other thing I would say, and I just like to say this every time this matter comes up, if we could find a way of dealing with the weed seed and the weed buds, so the bulbs and the corms and all those sort of people, if we could find a way of dealing with that, then the nutrients would in fact not be much of a problem, probably, because our plants, this particular group of native plants, generally speaking, quite like the nutrients. It's just that we need to reduce the nutrients to allow them to become competitive to our germinating natives. I mean, they're highly competitive once they're established, but during that critical establishment phase from a direct sow, they just can't compete with a nutrient-rich, enriched exotic flora in the short term. I mean, Paul's work was run over 3 years, and that was his very, very clear finding. But if we're willing to take a generational approach to this thing, a decadal approach to these things, then with the vast areas that have to be recovered, we probably do have to have longitudinal stuff that goes on for decades and pushes things in a particular direction. But if you want a quick result, then something like what Katherine's talking about, what I'm talking about, is probably the only way we know about at the moment that's going to work. But yeah, all power to your work, because we'll watch that with interest.
Yes, and we're lucky to have the incredibly troublesome weed invasion through the Western Grassland Reserve. So we've got 15,000 hectares of grassland we can practice on. Yes,
That's right,
indeed.
Yeah.
I'm conscious we've got time ticking on. Are there other questions that need to be hurled at Katherine?
I've just answered a couple in the chat, Adrian, but for the benefit of everyone, there was the question whether or not we plan to burn these plots in the near future. And this one is very close to my heart. It's something I've been campaigning for, and I think we definitely hope so. and we hope that that will happen soon. But in the short term, what we're doing is to manage is we're cutting these plots once a year to replicate a burn cycle and stripping the cut biomass away so that we're not getting those nutrient levels elevating over time.
Katherine, have you, sorry, just to jump in, have you done much engagement stuff? Like, have you been running questionnaires with the people opposite or anything like that to judge the level of acceptance of these grasslands? Is that level of research going in?
Not in any scientific sense, but certainly setting up a 1,300 square metre sown area in the context of a pandemic leads to a lot of long conversations. And I think what we were expecting was pushback, and we were expecting a little bit of uncertainty or discomfort with this style of planting in the urban domain, especially seeing we're opposite very manicured Victorian houses and the like. But we had almost, quite overwhelming support, apart from the one fella who just walked across them every day and ruined one of my plots. But I think, I think sometimes in Australia we can discourage ourselves and say, oh, people aren't ready for this kind of thing. We actually think we are ready for a looser style of planting. I think we are ready for a greater representation of Indigenous species in our urban landscape. And I think a lot of people are really hungry to see this done more broadly.